The axe fell in a clean downward arc, and the pine log split along its grain with a sound like a rifle crack swallowed by the wind. Wren Calloway set the two halves aside without looking at them, placed another round on the chopping block, and swung again. She had been at this since first light, working through the cold, with the methodical patience of someone who understood that winter did not negotiate. The sky above Sagebrush Flats had gone the color of old pewter overnight, and the air carried that particular sharpness that old-timers in Crook County recognized not as autumn's end, but as something more final, the first breath of a season that intended to mean business. She was not a large woman. Anyone watching from the low-rise to the east might have thought so at first, seeing the way she handled the double-bit axe, the way her shoulders absorbed each impact without wasted motion. But what read as size was something else entirely, a density of purpose built over years of work that asked everything of a body and offered nothing back but competence. Her dark brown hair was pulled back and tied with a strip of leather at the base of her neck. Her eyes, the gray blue of shallow creek water in November, stayed fixed on the wood. She did not look up when the wagon appeared on the eastern track. She heard it. The creak of iron wheel rims on frozen ruts, the particular rhythm of a horse kept to a deliberate pace by someone in no hurry, because they held all the time in the world. She heard it registered, it placed another round on the block, and split it. Then another. It was only after the fourth log that she set the axe head down on the block, pulled off her right glove, and wiped a sliver of bark from her cheek with the back of her hand. The wagon carried two men. She recognized Harlan Voss before she could make out his face clearly. Something in the way he sat upright and self-contained, as though the wagon were a throne he had merely chosen to make portable. He was somewhere past 50, his face angular and dry, the kind of face that gave nothing away because it had long ago decided that giving things away was for people who could afford the loss. Behind him on the wagon bench sat Sheriff Denton Marsh, his gaze directed at a point somewhere between the horizon and a place he clearly wished he were instead. Wren did not move toward them. She stood beside the chopping block with her glove in her hand and waited for them to come to her. They pulled the wagon to a stop near the cabin's front door. Voss climbed down without assistance, his boots settling into the frozen ground with a sound like something being declared. Marsh stayed on the bench a moment longer than necessary before following. Inside the cabin held the smell of wood smoke, coffee grounds, and the clean mineral scent of the limestone Elias Calloway had used to chink the gaps between the square-hewn logs. The table was pine hand-planed, its surface worn smooth in the center, where 30 years of elbows and plates and open books had polished it to a gentle dip. Wren's father had built the table the same week he built the cabin, in 1868, the first autumn on the land, and it had not moved from its place beneath the south window since. Voss sat down without being invited. He placed a folded document on the table between them, smooth and deliberate, the way a man sets down a winning hand when he wants the other person to understand that the game ended some time ago. The paper was a transfer of title. 200 acres of Sagebrush Flats, Crook County, Wyoming Territory. Signatory Elias R. Calloway. Date of execution March 14, 1881. Collateral against a debt of $800 now called due. The county seal of Sundance was pressed into the lower right corner with the kind of authority that asked no questions of itself. Wren looked at the signature for a long time. The room was quiet enough that she could hear the wind finding the gap above the east-facing window, the one she had been meaning to repack with fresh clay before the real cold came. Her father's handwriting had been a slow and deliberate thing. The thickened joints of his fingers, compounded over decades of gripping stone hammers and cold iron chisels, had given every letter a slight tremor, a controlled hesitation between strokes. His capital C, the C of Calloway, had always been made in two separate movements, the arc breaking slightly before rejoining, because his right hand, the thumb broken in the winter of 1867, during a stoneworking accident, and never set quite straight, could not sustain a continuous curve without losing pressure. The C on the document before her was a single confident sweep round and unbroken, the mark of a hand that had never suffered anything. She did not say this. She folded the knowledge away. Marsh shifted his weight. The leather of his gun belt moved against the chair back with a sound like something apologizing for itself. The document's been affirmed, Miss Calloway. Judge Pruitt reviewed it in Sundance last month. I don't have any authority to dispute what's been lawfully stamped. Voss watched her with the patience of a man who had rehearsed this scene and found her reaction so far to be within acceptable parameters. "You have 7 days." His voice had the quality of a closing door, not slammed simply shut. "Whatever you can load onto one wagon you may take. The land, the structure, the outbuildings, and everything fixed to the ground belong to the estate now. I'd suggest you begin making arrangements." Wren looked at him. There was a silence between them that she made no effort to fill. Voss continued because silence in others made him feel the need to establish that he had already accounted for it. He explained that the debt had been a matter of record, that Elias had known what he was signing, that this was simply the orderly resolution of an obligation. He spoke of it with the mild regret of a man discussing whether he had not caused, but was prepared to acknowledge. When he finished, Wren looked at Marsh. Marsh looked at the table. "I'll need to see to my stock before dark," she said. They left. She stood in the doorway and watched the wagon diminish along the eastern track until it was a small dark shape against the gray land, and then nothing. Then she went back to the chopping block and picked up the axe. She split wood for another 2 hours. Not from anger, she had no interest in anger, which spent itself in noise and left nothing useful behind. She split wood because the wood needed splitting, because the stack against the cabin's north wall was still 4 courses short of what she calculated she needed to carry through to April, and because the rhythmic work of it gave her hands something to do while the rest of her mind went to work on the problem with the same quiet thoroughness her father had brought to setting stone. The problem was not the document. The document was false, and false things had a way of being undone if you were patient enough to find the mechanism. The problem was time. 7 days was not enough to reach Sundance. Find a lawyer willing to take a case against Harlan Voss, who held notes on half the businesses in Anvil Creek, and return with anything resembling legal recourse. The problem was also money, because the lawyer question was theoretical in the absence of it, and Wren had $11.40 in the tin box under the floorboard beside the hearth. She stacked the last of the split wood as the light began to fail. The clouds to the north had thickened through the afternoon, and their underside had taken on that particular bruise quality that preceded not a gentle first snow, but something with intent behind it. She went inside, lit the lamp, and sat at her father's table with a piece of paper and a stub of pencil. The walk into Anvil Creek was 5 miles along the creek road, and she set out before dawn to arrive before the morning trade was done. The town was small and knew itself to be small, which gave it a certain economy of pretension. One main street of board-fronted buildings, a church at the western end, a livery at the eastern, and between them the compressed commerce of a community doing its best against the odds of geography in winter. Wren went first to the office of James Alcott, the only man in Anvil Creek who called himself a lawyer with any documentation to support the claim. He heard her out from behind his desk with the expression of a man watching a situation he had already categorized. When she finished, he told her that he had a conflict that prevented him from taking the case. He used the word conflict with careful neutrality. He did not specify its nature. He did not meet her eyes when she stood to leave. She tried the land office, where a clerk named Paris told her that the county record had already been updated to reflect the transfer, and that any challenge would need to originate in Sundance. With documentation she would need a lawyer to prepare. At the general store, she found Lottie Fenwick behind the counter with the careful, preoccupied expression of a woman managing something difficult. Lottie was in her middle 40s, her hair the faded red of a flag left too long in weather. She had known Wren since Wren could reach the penny candy jar on the second shelf, and she did not look up immediately when Wren came through the door. Wren told her what she needed: salt, a box of matches, a length of rope. Simple things, practical things. Lottie's hands moved to the shelf and stopped. "Your credit's been suspended, Wren." She said it quietly, her eyes directed at the shelf. "It's not, I don't have a choice about it. Mr. Voss holds the note on my inventory loan. He sent word yesterday." Wren counted out the coins she had brought. It was enough for the salt and the matches. She took them. At the door she paused. Behind the counter, through the gap in the curtain that led to the back storage room, she heard a sound, the scrape of a chair on a wooden floor. The small, unmistakable sounds of someone eating. Lottie moved from behind the counter in the same moment, heading toward the back with a cup in her hand. She saw Wren still at the door. "For the cat," Lottie said, and her voice did not change in any way that someone might later have called suspicious. Simply an explanation offered for an observed movement. Wren nodded. She stepped outside. She stood on the boardwalk for a moment in the cold morning air. Lottie Fenwick did not keep a cat. Wren had known this since she was a child, because Lottie's eyes swelled and watered within minutes of proximity to any of them, a fact that had been a source of mild commiseration at every town gathering where someone brought a barn cat indoors. A cup of something hot carried to the back room for a cat that did not exist. Wren filed the information where she kept things she did not yet understand. The minister's wife found her on the boardwalk and offered a room in the church attic. "Just until you can make other arrangements," she said with the particular gentleness of a person who believes they are doing what they can, but suspects it may not be enough. Wren thanked her and declined. She walked the 5 miles back to the homestead with the salt and the matches in her coat pocket, the wind behind her now pushing at her back with a cold that meant something. What she understood by the time the cabin roof appeared above the rise was that Voss had not simply filed a false document. He had constructed a system around the false document, a network of suspended credit, withheld assistance, and calculated social pressure designed to ensure that the document never needed to be defended, only waited out. He did not need her to be defeated in any dramatic sense. He needed her to run out of options quietly to find that every door she tried had already been latched from the inside, until the practical reality of her situation did the work his paper only initiated. It was a thorough plan. She could appreciate the thoroughness of it, the way she could appreciate a piece of equipment built with care for a destructive purpose. Inside the cabin, she sat at the table again. The lamp threw its narrow circle of light. Outside, the wind had picked up, and she could hear it in the cottonwoods along the creek, that high scouring note that preceded a change in the weather's ambitions. She thought about her father. Elias Calloway had not been a man given to explanation. He had been a man given to demonstration, to showing, rather than telling, to letting the physical world carry the lesson. He had taught her to read weather by watching how the horses stood in a field. He had taught her to judge the load-bearing capacity of a beam by the sound it made when you struck it with a knuckle. He had taught her 100 things she had learned so thoroughly that she had ceased to think of them as learned things at all, absorbing them into the general fabric of how she understood the world to work. The summer she was 14, he had taken her up the slope of the hill that rose from the western edge of the property, the one the local men called no-account land, because it was too rocky and steep for grazing or cultivation, the kind of terrain that made a claim look smaller on paper than it actually was. He had been digging for 3 weeks before he brought her to see it. The excavation was larger than anything she had expected. Not a root cellar, which was what the neighbors had assumed when they saw him hauling flat stones from the creek bed in a borrowed mule cart. A root cellar was a practical thing, a sensible thing, a 3x4 hole in the ground with a wooden door and a rough shelf for turnips. What her father had dug into the south-facing slope of that hill was something else entirely. 10 feet by 12 feet of interior space, the walls lined with flat stones fitted together without mortar, a technique he had taught himself through patient experiment over years of working stone wrested from the material itself through the logic of weight and friction and angle. Each stone was chosen for the flatness of 2 opposing faces and fitted to its neighbors with a precision that came from understanding how stone wanted to sit, rather than forcing it into a shape it resisted. The floor was earth-packed and smooth. The ceiling was heavy timber, 6 inches thick, packed above with 2 feet of earth and sod. He had her place her palm against the wall. The stone was cool but not cold, a different quality of temperature than the air above ground, which had been near 90 degrees that July afternoon. Down here, the air held a stillness, a constancy that felt almost deliberate. "The ground remembers August and January," her father said. He was not a poetic man, and the sentence sounded less like poetry than like a physical principle stated in its simplest form. He tapped the stone wall with his finger. 4 feet below the frost line, the temperature doesn't change. Hot day in July, cold night in February, down here it stays at 50 degrees. The earth holds the heat from summer and won't release it until spring comes around and puts more heat back in. He showed her the 2 pipes he had already installed, lengths of iron pipe, one set low in the wall near the floor, one running up through the roof timbers. He explained them with the seriousness he brought to all technical things. The low pipe drew in cold, dense air from outside feeding combustion. The high pipe vented warmer, lighter air upward, creating a slow circulation that kept the oxygen fresh without surrendering more heat than was necessary. You needed both, he said. Without the intake, fire would not draw. Without the exhaust, the air would foul, and a person would stop thinking clearly before they understood why. Ren had asked him why he was building it so far from the cabin. He had been quiet for a moment, leaning on his shovel, looking out through the excavation's entrance at the pale summer valley below. "You prepare for the winter you don't see coming," he said at last. "A sickness, a fire, a failure of charity, a man with a piece of paper." He did not elaborate. He did not explain why those four possibilities were paired in his mind or what specific experience had taught him to hold them together. He simply handed her a stone and showed her where it needed to go. She had understood at 14 that she was being given something. She had not understood what. She understood now. The night before the seventh day, Ren did not sleep. She moved through the cabin in the dark with the lamp turned low, doing the last things that needed doing. She packed a canvas sack with the salt, the matches, a whetstone, 2 wool blankets, the small cast iron pot, and the axe. She left most of the furniture where it stood. She left the dishes stacked on the shelf. She left the curtains her mother had sewn from flour sacking hanging in the windows, because taking them would have required a kind of deliberate farewell she was not prepared to make. Before dawn, she went to the small lean-to attached to the barn's north side, where her horse Cinder was stabled. The animal was 17 years old, a compact bay with a white blaze and the calm, practical temperament of a creature that had long since decided there was no situation worth panic. Ren pressed her forehead briefly against the horse's neck, breathing in the warm animal smell, then tacked up with the same efficiency she brought to everything. She led Cinder out into the pre-dawn dark. The first snow had not yet fallen, but it was close. She could taste it in the air, that particular mineral absence of smell that preceded snow, the way silence preceded a door opening. She swung up, settled into the saddle, and turned west. The cabin was behind her. She did not look back at it, not because she was denying herself the sight, but because she had already seen it, had stored it precisely, and carrying the image forward served nothing. What was ahead of her was the hill, the slope, the south-facing exposure, the gnarled old pine at the crest, with its bark grown thick over a mark cut into it 11 years ago. She was not running. Running was what Voss had planned for the panicked eastward departure, the woman on the road to Anvil Creek, or the longer road to Sundance, diminishing into the landscape and becoming someone else's problem. What she was doing was something else entirely. She was moving from one part of her father's design to another. Behind her, as the first pale light began to separate the sky from the hills, thin smoke rose from the cabin's chimney with no one inside to tend it. She had banked the fire before leaving, giving any early observer the impression of a house still occupied. Within the hour, the fire would go cold. By the time Voss sent anyone to check, the cabin would be empty, and the tracks would lead west into the territory he had always regarded as no-account land, too broken and steep to be worth the trouble of following. The snow began to fall as she crested the first rise, not gently, not with the tentative quality of a first November dusting, but with the settled, purposeful intensity of something that had made up its mind. It came in hard, granular flakes driven sideways by a wind out of the northwest, and within minutes the tracks Cinder left in the frozen ground were beginning to fill. Ren rode with her chin tucked and her eyes on the slope above, looking for the pine. She found it where she had known it would be, just below the crest of the hill's western shoulder, its trunk thick as a man's chest, its roots splayed over the surface rock, in a pattern that looked at first glance like nothing more than the ordinary ambitions of a tree trying to hold itself to difficult ground. She dismounted, tied Cinder to a low branch, and began to clear the snow from the area around the roots with her boot. The stones were there, flat, carefully chosen, fitted into the slope, as though they had always been part of it, which in a sense they had been intended to be. The largest, the slab that served as the door, was overgrown at its edges, with the root systems of the pine locked into place by 11 years of slow vegetable patience. She found the crevice her father had described to her once, without drama, as the place where a bar or a stiff handle could be inserted to get purchase. She used the axe handle. It took her nearly 2 hours, working methodically, resting when her arms gave out, adjusting the angle of leverage, trying again. The cold worked against her. Her fingers inside the gloves had gone from cold to painful, to something beyond pain that registered only as diminished precision. When the slab finally moved, a grinding, reluctant shift of stone against stone, earth against sky, the air that rose from below stopped her completely. It was cool, not cold. It smelled of dry earth, of time, of something resinous and faint that she could not immediately name, and then recognized as the oil her father had used to treat the wooden crate he had placed inside before sealing the entrance. It smelled like a promise kept over a very long time. She lit a match, shielded it with her body, and looked down. The steps were as he had built them, stone set level 8 of them, descending into a chamber that the match's small light just barely reached. Against the far wall, she could see the shape of stacked supplies, the orderly geometry of a man who had planned in advance and packed with care. The walls stood straight. The timbers overhead were solid. She descended, letting the match die, standing in the dark for a moment with her hand on the stone wall beside her. Then she climbed back up, brought Cinder in from the cold, and began. On the flat top of this wooden crate, as her second match illuminated the chamber properly, she found the oilskin pouch. Inside were two things. The first was a document, a certificate of title, executed March 3, 1869. Bearing two signatures, she read carefully. August Fenwick. Harold Greer, her father's name at the top in the county clerk's formal hand, and below it, the property description, 200 acres in the high plains of Crook County, Wyoming Territory, granted in full. His thumbprint in ink at the bottom slightly offset to the right because he had always led with the pad rather than the tip, a habit of the hand. The second thing was a single sheet of paper in her father's handwriting. Not a letter, not an explanation. The words were brief, written in the deliberate, careful script of a man for whom writing was physical labor. If you found this, you know what the paper means. Find August. Wren stood in the underground dark with both documents in her hands, the cold of the stone around her, pressing in from all sides, the sound of the wind above, completely absent, now filtered out by earth and time, and the precise, unhurried architecture of a man who had trusted stone more than any court in any county. She folded both papers and placed them back in the oilskin pouch. She tucked the pouch inside her coat against her ribs. Then she looked at the walls around her, at the pipes her father had installed at the small stone firebox, waiting to be built, at the stacked sacks of dried beans, the tins of coffee, the two barrels with their lids sealed in wax, the tools arranged against the east wall, with the quiet order of things placed with the expectation of being found and used. Outside, the snow was falling in earnest now, and it would not stop for a long time. She picked up the short-handled shovel and got to work. The first thing she built was the cold sink. It was not the stove, not the sleeping arrangement, not the insulation for the entrance, all of which were more immediately obvious needs. The cold sink came first because her father had explained the principle with a specificity that told her he considered it foundational. Cold air was heavy. It settled. Without somewhere deliberate for it to go, it would pool across the floor of the chamber in an invisible layer that would leach heat from everything it touched, including a sleeping body, faster than the walls ever could. She took the short-handled shovel and dug a trench 6 inches deep along the perimeter of the floor, following the base of the walls on 3 sides, leaving the 4th open near the entrance. The excavated earth she mounded against the interior face of the door slab, packing it with her boots to create an additional thermal barrier. The work warmed her. That was its own instruction. By the time the trench was complete, her shoulders ached in a specific deep way that she recognized as the good kind of pain, the kind that meant the body had been properly used. She rested for 10 minutes, eating a handful of dried beans straight from the sack, washing them down with a cup of creek water she had carried in the cast-iron pot. Then she turned to the stove. Her father had left a pile of stones in the northeast corner, not random stones, but chosen ones, each flat on at least 2 faces, sorted roughly by size. He had thought ahead to this moment with the patience of a man who understood that good preparation looked like excess until the moment it looked like salvation. Wren sorted through the pile, identifying the flattest pieces for the base courses, the more irregular ones for the upper structure, where she could use their imperfections to create a natural draft channel through the firebox. She built slowly. Each stone placed tested with a palm for wobble, adjusted, tested again. The mortar was clay. She dug it from the floor near the east wall where the soil changed color, going from the pale tan of the surface to the dense blue-gray of true clay at about 8 inches. She mixed it with dry grass from the bundle her father had left hanging on a wooden peg, working it with her hands until it moved like wet bread dough, then packed it into the joints with her thumb. The stove took the better part of 2 days to build. On the second afternoon, she installed the flue, a length of hollowed log her father had prepared and stored against the north wall, its interior smooth from careful work with a long-handled auger. She packed it where it passed through the roof timbers with fresh clay, working carefully around the existing ventilation pipes to maintain their function. When she pressed her palm over the low intake pipe, she could feel the faint draw of outside air, even with the stove cold. Then she made her first serious mistake. She had been so focused on the stove's construction that when she finally loaded kindling and lit the first fire, she was thinking about heat output, about the clay joints and whether they had cured enough about the thermal mass of the riverstone she planned to heat for her sleeping space. She was not thinking about the pipes. She lit the fire, watched it catch, felt the first genuine warmth radiate from the stone firebox. Then the smoke came back. It did not curl gently. It poured thick gray smoke, filling the lower chamber in the time it took her to understand what was happening. She dropped to her hands and knees where the air was still breathable, her eyes burning, her mind running through her father's words with desperate speed. Low pipe draws cold in, high pipe lets warm out. She had installed the flue beside the high exhaust pipe, which was correct. She had sealed the clay around both, which was correct. She had, and then she understood. In the dark, working by feel, she had connected the flue wrong. The smoke was being directed into the intake pipe instead of the exhaust. She had reversed the draw. She crawled to the entrance, shoved the door slab with both arms until it ground open, 6 inches, pressed her face to the gap, and breathed. The outside air hit her like cold water thrown in the face of someone sleeping, clarifying total without apology. She lay there for a full minute breathing, letting the smoke find its way out around her. When she went back inside, she fixed it. The correction took 2 hours of careful work in near dark, repacking the clay, reversing the connection, waiting for the smoke to clear before she could confirm the repair. She built the fire again, smaller this time, a handful of kindling no larger than her thumb. The smoke went up. The draft held. She sat on the earthen floor and let her hands shake for a moment. Not from cold. She had been frightened, and being frightened was information. It told her that she had been moving too fast, trusting confidence where precision was required. She would not make that mistake again. The blizzard arrived on the 3rd week. She heard it before it arrived, a change in the quality of the silence above a new register, in the way the wind moved over the hill's crest, as though the air itself had decided to stop pretending. The temperature dropped 8 degrees in the space of an afternoon. That evening, the intake pipe began to whistle with a thin, urgent note that told her what was coming was not a storm, but a siege. She spent the last hours before full darkness doing what could still be done. She carried the remaining pine boughs she had gathered and stuffed them around the door slab's perimeter until no light came through the seams. Inside, she strung rope between the roof timbers. Her father had left the rope coiled on the wooden crate for that purpose, and hung 2 of the heavy wool blankets to create a tent within the chamber, a space just large enough for a sleeping pallet, reducing the volume of air she would need to keep warm by roughly 2/3. She pulled Cinder into the main chamber and positioned the horse near the entrance where the animal's body heat would serve as a living buffer against the cold seeping through the door. By the time she sealed herself in and lit the stove to its working temperature, the blizzard had arrived in full. What came down was not weather in any ordinary sense. It was a physical force with the quality of intention wine that shook the ground above her in deep, rhythmic concussions, snow that scoured the hillside and packed itself into every depression with a density that would resist a shovel for days. Inside the chamber, with the door sealed and the blanket tent containing the stove's heat, the sounds arrived muffled and distant, filtered through 2 feet of packed earth. The storm was real. The storm was absolute. She was somewhere outside its jurisdiction. She heated 3 river stones directly on the stove's surface for 2 hours. When they were hot enough to make saliva evaporate on contact, she carried them one by one into the blanket tent, using folded canvas, and arranged them near her sleeping pallet. She sealed the tent flap. Within the small enclosed space, the temperature climbed. The cold that had been pressing in from every direction receded, not completely, not permanently, but enough. She lay on the pallet of pine needles and wool, listening to the storm attempting the hill above her, and felt something she had not allowed herself to feel since Voss had placed his false document on her father's table. The feeling was not relief. It was something more structural than relief, a recognition that the principles her father had trusted were holding that stone and earth, and the physics of heat were keeping their end of an arrangement made 11 years ago on a summer afternoon when a 14-year-old girl had carried rocks from a creek bed without fully understanding why. The old thermometer her father had left showed 49 degrees in the main chamber. In the tent, she estimated warmer. The world above her was in the deep negatives, the kind of cold that froze exposed water in minutes. The distance between that world and her own was approximately 7 feet of earth. She woke in the night to Cinder moving restlessly in the outer chamber, the horse's hooves grinding against the cold sink trench's edge. She went out, checked the animal, found her calm but alert. Wren fed her a measure of oats from the sack, pressed her forehead to the horse's neck for a moment in the dark, feeling the warmth that radiated from the large body like a banked fire. "You're all right," she told her. "We both are." The blizzard lasted 4 days. When it broke, the silence was so profound it had physical weight. Wren pushed the door slab open against the resistance of several feet of packed snow, working with the shovel until she had cleared enough to emerge. The landscape had been remade. The hill was a smooth white form, all its particularity buried, its familiar landmarks erased. The valley below was an unbroken field of white in which the shapes of cabins and barns registered only as gentle mounds, their hard edges softened into the general surrender of the terrain. She saw no smoke from any chimney in Anvil Creek. She did not stay outside long 10 minutes to assess, to breathe air that was clean and cold as ground glass, to confirm that the vent pipes were clear and the door seal had held. Then she went back inside, rebuilt the stove to working temperature, and boiled a pot of bean broth that she ate slowly, thinking about what the absence of smoke in the valley meant for the people living under those rounded white mounds. 12 days after the blizzard broke, on a night when the wind had briefly dropped and the temperature had climbed to a merely brutal -10, she heard sounds from above. Not the wind, not the settling of snow, something purposeful. A scraping, then a pattern that her mind resolved after a moment into boots working through deep crust. Then a voice ragged with cold, "Miss Calloway. Wren, please, if you can hear me." Walt Seeger's voice had the particular quality of a man past the point where pride is relevant. She took up the axe from habit before pushing the door open. Walt was there, collapsed into the snow above the entrance. His coat wrong for the temperature, too thin, a barn coat rather than a winter coat, the kind of error a man made in the spring when he put things away and then found himself in a different winter than the one he remembered. Behind him, huddled together under a single inadequate blanket, were his children. The boy was 6, the girl perhaps 4. Their faces were the color of cold wax. Wren did not speak. She reached up, took the girl first, passed her down the steps, went back for the boy, then helped Walt descend. Inside the tent, the children sat wordless in the warmth, their eyes moving from the small stove to the placid form of Cinder in the outer chamber to Wren's face, with the wide processing look of very young people encountering something their categories could not yet contain. She gave them bean broth from the pot heated to just below scalding in the 2 tin cups her father had stored in the crate. The girl wrapped both hands around her cup and bent her head over it as though the steam itself was medicine. Walt told her in pieces between the shivers that still moved through him. In waves, the roof had given way in the back room under snow weight. His wife, Patience, was home with a fever that had been climbing for 4 days. The wood was gone, not low gone. He had burned the kitchen table 2 nights ago. He had heard from a neighbor who had heard from another that there was smoke coming from the hill above the Calloway claim, that somehow Wren Calloway was alive up there in the cold, that had killed 2 of old Tidmore's cattle and frozen the well solid at the Hanson place. He looked at her across the dim space with an expression she recognized, the look of a man who has run out of his own resources and arrived at the edge of someone else's, not knowing whether what he is about to ask will be given or refused, knowing only that he has no alternative. She gave him broth. She gave him warmth. She gave the children a corner of the blanket tent and let them sleep. Then she took a flat piece of stone from the floor and a stub of charcoal from beside the stove. She drew the firebox in cross-section. She drew the flue, the intake pipe, the exhaust pipe, labeling their positions with letters. She then explained. She sketched the cold sink trench, the insulation arrangement for the door, the method of banking earth against the outer wall to slow the ground-level heat loss. She kept her voice level, her explanations precise, moving from principle to application without ornamentation. Walt watched his shivering gradually subsiding as the warmth worked through him, his eyes tracking the diagram with the focused attention of a man who had understood that his survival depended on what he learned in the next 20 minutes. When she finished, she handed him the stone. "Draw it back," she told him. He drew it imperfectly at first, then with her corrections, then again from memory. By the 3rd repetition, it was accurate enough to build from. She gave him the full sack of beans, 2 candles, the spare rope. She kept the matches, but gave him the flint she found in the crate's lower drawer. He stood to leave the children wrapped in the blanket she gave them, his eyes carrying something new. Not gratitude exactly, which was too simple, but a kind of altered understanding, the look of a man who has discovered that what he thought was a gift was actually an instruction. I don't know how to thank you for this. She met his eyes. You build what I showed you, and you show the next person who comes to your door. That's how. Walt left before dawn, picking his way down the slope with the children, the diagram stone tucked inside his coat against his chest like something sacred. 3 days later, Sheriff Denton Marsh came up the hill alone. He had not come as an officer of the court. He had come because his conscience, which he had been successfully suppressing for the better part of 2 months, had finally presented itself as a physical symptom. He could not ignore a tightness behind his sternum that woke him at 3 in the morning with the specific quality of something that needed to be acted upon, or it would act upon itself. He had expected following Walt Seeger's faint tracks up the slope to find a body. The discovery of a thin line of smoke rising from the hillside in its place had stopped him at the crest for a full minute before he called her name. When Wren emerged from the entrance, squinting against the flat white light, Marsh stared at her with an expression that moved through several phases too quickly for her to catalog all of them. She was thinner than she had been. Her face had the paired, concentrated quality of someone who had been spending no energy on anything unnecessary. Her eyes were clear. He looked at the vent pipe at the door slab, at the organized fact of her survival, and his expression settled into something close to shame. We thought most of us thought you'd left. With this cold, nobody expected. Harlan Voss owns a forged document. Her voice carried no heat. It was a statement, not an accusation, the recitation of a physical fact, like noting that a beam was unsound. My father never signed it. You looked at his hands every week for 6 years in that valley, and you know what they could do. Marsh said nothing. He looked at the snow. There's a man named August Fenwick, Wren continued. He signed the real title in 1869 as a witness. Find out if he's still alive. Marsh looked up then. Something moved in his face. You already know where he is, she said. The sheriff turned without answering and went back down the slope. She watched him go with the same still attention she brought to reading weather measuring, what she had seen filing it in the place where things that were not yet useful became things she would need later. The hard cold arrived in January without announcement or ceremony. The valley people called it a blue norther, the old ones who remembered the winter of 1864 and compared everything to it. The sky went brilliant and cloudless, which was the cruelest thing about it all. That light, all that apparent clarity, and temperatures that dropped to -28 at midday, to -35 in the nights touching -41 on the coldest night of the second week. Unprotected metal became brittle. The creek froze to the bottom in 3 days, and the sound it made in doing so was a long, low groan that carried across the valley like a building settling into a new and permanent configuration. Inside the hill, Wren's system performed with the flawless indifference of a proven physical law. The snow blanket above the chamber had grown to 4 feet, then 6, in insulating mass that held the ground's residual warmth in place with a thoroughness that no amount of burning wood could have replicated from outside. The main chamber held at 48 degrees through the worst of it. In the blanket tent with the stove running its disciplined 3-log burn, and the heated stones replaced every 4 hours, she lived in 60 degrees. She read. Her father had left a copy of Marcus Aurelius in the crate's upper compartment. The binding cracked from handling pencil marks in the margins in his particular cramped notation. She read it slowly, going back over passages, finding in its insistence on the subordination of circumstance to character something that felt less like philosophy than like a manual for the specific situation she was in. The obstacle itself becomes the path forward. She had heard that from no one, and she read it there and understood it in her body before she understood it in her mind. More people came. The Hendersons, a father, his teenage son. No mother in the picture arrived on the 12th night of the Blue Norther. The boy's ears frostbitten, the father's expression, carrying the particular devastation of a man who has failed to protect his child. She brought them in, treated the ears with careful warming, no rubbing, no direct heat, just the chamber's ambient temperature and time, and fed them. Then she taught the father what she had taught Walt. Reverend Oakes came the following week, not in desperation, but in the deliberate, humbled manner of a man who has reassessed his categories. He had been burning church furniture for 3 days. His wife's cough had worsened. He sat across from Wren in the dim chamber with his hands folded between his knees and said something she did not forget. I told my congregation in October that Providence would provide. I believe that now more than I did then. I just understand the mechanism differently. She gave him the same instructions she had given everyone, the same diagram, the same requirement that he be able to reproduce it before he left. In Harlan Voss's appropriated house, the cold was winning. The house was large, drafty, built with green lumber that had shrunk in the extreme temperatures and opened gaps the width of a finger along the wall joints. Voss had his men stuff rags into every gap they could find, bank snow against the foundation, double the frequency of the fires. It was not enough. A house that size, built the way that house was built, consumed firewood at a rate that was approaching the boundary of his store's capacity to supply it. He was spending money to be cold. He was expending resources, his primary talent, the management of resources, and falling further behind with each expenditure. He stood at the window on the worst night looking toward the hill that rose above what was still legally his property and saw nothing. No light, no movement. Only the hard, brilliant stars above the snowfield, and the knowledge confirmed by Marcia's reluctant report that the woman he had driven from that land was alive up there in the cold that was defeating him in his own house. He had assumed her survival was a temporary condition. He was beginning to understand that the resolution he had been waiting for was not going to come from the weather. On the 14th night of the Blue Norther, he went to Marsh. What passed between them was not a conversation Wren would ever directly know, but its consequence arrived 3 days later when a rider came to the base of the hill. Not to the entrance, not close enough to call up, and stood at the bottom of the slope long enough to make clear he had been sent to observe. He counted the vent pipes. He looked at the angle of the slope. He looked at the door slab's approximate location. Then he rode back toward Anvil Creek. That same evening, Walt Seeger came up the hill with a warning Marsh had been asking in town about the layout of the hill, about how many approaches there were, about whether any of the neighbors had been in contact with Wren. Voss was not waiting for the weather anymore. Wren listened. She took the information and placed it alongside everything else she had been holding, the oilskin pouch inside her coat, the 2 names on the document within it, the thing Marcia's expression had told her when she mentioned August Fenwick. She had one piece she could not yet play, and she was not yet in position to play it, but the board was becoming clearer. "How is your stove holding?" she asked Walt. He almost smiled. "Holding fine. Patience is on her feet. The kids sleep warm." He paused. 3 other families in our part of the valley built from the diagram. 2 more are building now. She nodded. The knowledge was moving outward from her toward the people who needed it, replicating itself in stone and clay, and the careful labor of hands that had never done such work before. Knowledge that saved only its holder was knowledge poorly used. Her father had left her enough for herself, and she had always understood that the excess was meant to be given away. That night alone in the blanket tent with the stones cooling and the stove at its low-maintenance burn, she heard Cinder shift in the outer chamber. The horse had been quieter the past 2 days, eating less. The cold she had managed to hold at bay through the worst weeks was pressing harder now, finding small inefficiencies in the insulation she had not been able to fully correct. She went out to check. Cinder was standing but listing slightly to one side, her breathing slow. Wren put her hand on the horse's neck and felt the temperature there. Not the warm, living heat of a healthy animal, but something diminished, as though the cold had found its way inside from a direction the insulation could not address. She stayed with Cinder through the night. She brought more boughs, packed them tighter against the outer walls, moved the last heated stone from her own sleeping space into the horse's area. By morning, the breathing had steadied. The temperature in the outer chamber had dropped 2 degrees overnight. The next night was colder. She knew by the second morning that she was not going to be able to save the horse from what was coming. She knew it with the same quiet certainty with which she knew when a joint was not going to hold, or when a piece of wood had rot in its center, not hope or fear, but plain reading of what was there. Cinder had been 17 years old when they came up the hill. She had carried Wren and her father before her on 10,000 ordinary days, had stood patient in weather, and noise had lived the whole of her life in the uncomplaining, dignified manner of a working animal that asked for nothing except competence from the person in charge of her. She died before dawn on the 16th day of the Blue Norther, quietly in the outer chamber with Wren's hand on her neck. Wren sat with her for a time in the dark, not moving. Then she went to work. She could not dig in frozen ground. She moved the horse to the exterior with great effort, working alone in the bitter cold and packed snow around the body until spring. She found a flat stone near the entrance and set it at the head. It was not a burial. It was the best she could do. She went back inside, sealed the entrance, stood in the main chamber. The outer room was quieter now, the specific living warmth of the animal gone, replaced by simple cold that the physics of the chamber could manage, but that felt different from before, emptier, in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. She allowed herself to understand that she was grieving. She allowed herself to stand in the underground dark for exactly as long as it took to feel the full weight of what she had lost. Not just the horse, but the last warm living thing that had known her father, that had stood in the yard on mornings when Elias was still alive, to come out with a handful of oats and call the animal's name. Then she went to the stove, added 2 logs, waited for the heat to build, put her hands out to it. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. The stone did not mourn. The earth did not pause in its long, slow holding of summer's warmth. She had things to build, people to teach, a name to find, and a document in an oilskin pouch against her ribs that meant the winter, however long it intended to last, had already lost. The blue norther broke on a Tuesday, though Wren only knew this because she had been marking days on the timber above her sleeping pallet with a piece of charcoal, a single vertical stroke. For each morning she woke to the sound of wind, a diagonal cross through every 4 to keep the count honest. When the wind stopped, the silence it left behind was so absolute that she lay still for several minutes, uncertain whether her hearing had changed or the world had. She pushed the door slab open and stood in light so sharp it functioned less like illumination than like a physical force. The sky was a color that blue had no business being, the intense, depthless blue of something that had burned all its moisture away. Below her, the valley of sagebrush flats lay buried under a white so uniform it erased the distinction between field road and creek bed. The shapes of buildings in Anvil Creek registered as soft geometries beneath the snow, their hard angles surrendered to the general whiteness. Still no smoke from more than 2 chimneys in the valley. The ones that did show smoke were thin, tentative, the fires of people burning whatever remained. She went back inside, ate methodically, checked her stores. She had been more careful with the provisions than she had originally planned, rationing with a precision that had occasionally felt like cruelty, but now presented itself as wisdom. Enough beans for another 6 weeks. The second barrel, the molasses, still more than half full. Coffee for perhaps 3 weeks if she kept it weak. She had been keeping it weak since the 3rd week of December. The oilskin pouch had not left her body since she found it. She took it out, now opened it on the flat top of the crate, looked at both documents in the improved light. From the entrance she had propped open to air the chamber. The title certificate from 1869. Her father's note. She had read both so many times that she knew them by the quality of the paper rather than by sight, could have recited every word in the dark. What she could not do alone was transform them from evidence into verdict. For that she needed August Fenwick, a living man, whose name appeared on the document, whose memory of a specific afternoon in March of 1869 was the only thing in the world that could complete the chain from the paper in her hand to the land above her head. She folded them back into the pouch and pressed it against her ribs. Walt Seeger came up his hill that afternoon, moving through the new snow with the efficiency of a man who had learned to read the slope over months of practice. He looked different from the person who had arrived at her entrance in November, with his children wrapped in a single inadequate blanket. His coat was heavier. He had added an outer layer of canvas, roughly stitched, the kind of improvisation that spoke of someone who had learned to solve problems with available materials rather than waiting for better ones. She handed him the note before he could speak. 12 words written in her clearest hand on a piece of brown paper torn from a provision sack. August. I know he's there. I need him. Bring him if you can. Walt read it. He looked up. Something in his expression told her she had been right about what Marcia's face had said on the slope 3 weeks earlier. Lottie's been feeding him since October, he confirmed. Keeping him in the back storage room. Voss sent 2 men to the Fenwick house outside town in September. They told Lottie her father was required to appear before some legal proceeding in Sundance regarding the Callaway title. August told Lottie that if Voss needed him to appear somewhere, the only reason was to silence him one way or another. He's 78 years old. He understood what was being arranged. She looked at the slope below, at the white valley, at the long, cold distance between the hill where she stood and the general store where an old man had been eating his meals in a back room for 3 months, so that Harlan Voss would not know he existed. Can he travel? Walt considered this with the seriousness it deserved. He walked 3 miles the week before the first blizzard. His legs still work. His mind, a brief pause that was itself an answer, is sharp as it ever was. Sharper, maybe. Men who know they're the last witness to something tend to keep their faculties organized. She told him what she needed step by step. He listened without interrupting. He left before the light shifted. 4 days later, in the gray pre-morning of a cold that had climbed back towards something survivable, Walt returned. He was not alone. August Fenwick moved slowly but without apology. He was a large-framed man, reduced by age to something still substantial, his white hair visible beneath the brim of a hat that had been good once. His eyes under brows gone completely white were the clear, undeflected brown of a man who had stopped performing equanimity and simply arrived at it. Lottie had wrapped him in 3 layers, the outermost a buffalo coat that had been her grandfather's, and he wore it without irony because warmth was warmth. He descended the stone steps with Walt's hand at his elbow, looked around the chamber with the attentiveness of a man who appreciated quality work, placed his palm against the stone wall, pressed it flat. Elias built this. Not a question. You can tell a man's work from the way he fits the corners. Elias never left a corner he wasn't satisfied with. Wren sat across from him on the flat stone she used as a seat when working at the crate. She took out the oilskin pouch. She laid the certificate on the surface between them. August looked at it for a long moment without touching it. Then he reached out with his right hand, a large hand, the knuckles swollen but the fingers still precise, and placed his index finger on his own signature. March the 3rd, 1869, he said. Elias had been on the land since '67. He wanted it done properly. There were 2 of us there, myself, Harold Greer. Harold passed in '78. He looked up. Which leaves me. She asked him if he would go to Sundance and say before Judge Pruitt what he had just said to her. He looked at her across the dim chamber with the expression of a man who has been waiting for a question and is relieved to finally hear it asked. Young woman, I have been sitting in a storage room for 3 months eating Lottie's cooking, which is good, but repetitive specifically so that I would be available to answer that question. Yes. She told him there was one more thing she needed him to be prepared for. She told him what the document would need to establish not simply his signature, but the specific physical fact of her father's hand, the broken thumb, the limited capacity for a continuous curved stroke. She told him how Voss's lawyer would attack his credibility, the age argument, the memory argument, the argument that 78 years of living constituted a cloud over any recollection. August was quiet for a moment. Then, I remember Elias Calloway's hands because we spent 4 days in 1868 laying the foundation of this property's cabin together. I was doing the corner work, and he kept repositioning my stones not out of arrogance, but because he could see the load paths better than I could. His right thumb had been broken in a stoneworking accident the previous winter, and it never set straight. He held his hammer differently because of it. The grip changed the angle of every stroke. He paused. A man who signed that deed with the signature Voss is showing needed a hand that could execute a full unbroken curve. Elias Calloway, after the winter of 1867, did not have that capability. I will state that before any judge in any court in Wyoming Territory, and I will state it with the precision of someone who spent 30 years working stone alongside men and learned to read their hands the way a reader reads a page. The words settled into the chamber like stones placed by a careful hand. Wren folded the document, returned it to the pouch, pressed the pouch against her coat. That night, Harlan Voss came to the hill. She heard him before she saw him, the particular aggression of someone forcing their way through heavy snow, rather than working with it, the sound of effort applied without technique. She was at the entrance when he appeared over the crest alone, his face red with cold above the collar of his coat. He looked at the door slab, at the vent pipes, at the physical evidence of her survival arrayed before him, and something moved across his face that held elements of fury, disbelief, and the specific outrage of a man who has constructed a careful plan and found it engaged with a reality that did not recognize his plan's authority. He stopped perhaps 20 feet from the entrance. I know you have something, he began. Whatever Elias left up here, it belongs to the estate. You're sitting on my land in a structure on my property, and whatever documents you think give you a claim have already been superseded by a stamped and recorded transfer affirmed in Sundance. Wren stood at the entrance with her hands at her sides. She let him finish. Then she asked him the question she had been holding since the night she first looked at his document in the lamplight of her father's table. Did you know that my father's right thumb never healed straight after the winter of 1867? Voss stared at her. The question hung in the cold air between them. She watched his face for the thing she needed to see, not guilt, which was too simple, but the specific blankness of a man encountering information he had never thought to obtain. He had not known. He had acquired a forger, provided a name, checked the result against a signature from a decade earlier when the hand was different, secured a stamp from a judge he had cultivated for 3 years. He had done everything the plan required. He had simply never spent 4 days laying stone alongside Elias Calloway, and so the hand's history had not been available to him. His blankness lasted only a moment before his face reset. "Sign the relinquishment," he said, his voice stripped of its earlier legal register, carrying now only the bare current of what he wanted. 10 acres on the northeast corner. Enough to build on. You can live out your years on Callaway land, which is more than the law requires me to offer. Wren looked at him with the same steady attention she brought to a stone wall. She was assessing a fire. She was evaluating a pipe. She was checking for proper draw. She was not angry. She was reading him, and what she read was a man who had reached the bottom of his available arguments. "My father built something up here that you cannot take from me," she said, "because you cannot understand it well enough to know what it is." She stepped back into the entrance, took the door slab's edge in both hands. "Go home, Mr. Voss. Bank your foundation with snow and pack straw into your wall joints. Your firewood will last longer." She pulled the door closed. He did not leave immediately. She could hear him on the slope for several minutes, boots and snow movement that went nowhere with increasing frustration. Then the sound of departure. Then nothing. 3 nights later, Walt Seeger's lantern appeared on the slope at 2 in the morning, swinging in a pattern he had established as a warning signal. Wren was outside before he reached the entrance. Voss had sent 3 men. They had come up the north approach with tools for blocking the vent pipes, burlap sacks packed with snow fitted over the pipe openings from above. The plan was elementary in its brutality. Sealed pipes meant no combustion, no heat, survivable temperatures for perhaps 4 hours in the conditions that still held the valley. Walt had seen them cross the creek from his property line. The shot he fired was into the air above the tree line. It carried in the cold, with the clean, flat authority that gunfire had in open winter landscape. It did not echo. It arrived complete, a single declarative statement that the night received without comment. Reverend Oakes heard it from his rebuilt shelter on the south side of town. 2 of the Henderson boys heard it from the claim their father had been working since Wren taught him the method. 3 lanterns appeared on the slope within 20 minutes, their light crossing the snow toward the hill from different directions. Voss's men retreated before anyone reached them, but they had been seen by people who lived in the valley, who knew the hill, who understood what an attempt to block those pipes meant for the woman living beneath them. The retreat was not a defeat in any legal sense. It was a confession delivered to witnesses, and witnesses in small valleys had long memories. The spring came the way Wyoming springs always came, not gently, not as a gift, but as a negotiated settlement between the cold that had held everything and the sun that was prepared to insist. Snow melted from the south-facing slopes, first running in thin, clear channels that carved new routes through the frozen ground. The creek broke with a sound like the valley clearing its throat. The first week of March brought mud, which was its own kind of beauty after 4 months of white. Wren emerged from the hill in stages, spending more time each day above ground, assessing what the winter had done to the cabin, to the outbuildings, to the land itself. The cabin had held. One corner of the barn roof had taken damage. She could repair it in a day with salvaged timber. The ground was waterlogged but intact, and in the south-facing section of the property where the slope promoted drainage, the soil was already beginning to show the particular dark color of earth that was ready to receive something. Word that Wren Calloway was above ground again spread through Anvil Creek with the speed of information that people had been waiting to receive. Walt came first, then the Hendersons, then Reverend Oakes with his wife, whose cough had resolved sometime in February, in a shelter built from Wren's diagram on the lee side of the church foundation. They came not in the desperate manner of the winter months, but in the more deliberate way of people who had a purpose. They came to say that when the circuit judge arrived in Sundance for the April session, they intended to be there. Lottie Fenwick came 2 days before the scheduled hearing, arriving at the Hill in the early morning with a package wrapped in brown paper. Inside were three items: a pair of wool socks, a tin of proper coffee ground the day before, and a folded letter her father had written in the autumn before the blizzard, before the blue norther, which he had asked her to hold until it was needed. The letter documented in August's precise and aging hand his recollection of the March 1869, signing the physical condition of Elias Calloway's hands, the specific limitation of the right thumb's range of motion. It was not the same as testimony, but it was corroboration written in advance by a man who had understood that the opportunity to speak might not always arrive on schedule. Wren read the letter standing in the morning light outside the Hill's entrance, the new mud of the slope drying in the sun. She looked at Lottie, who had been running a store in Voss's economic shadow for 7 months, who had suspended Wren's credit with her eyes directed at a shelf, who had said, "For the cat," with a perfectly level voice while protecting the only witness who could undo everything Voss had constructed. "You've been holding this since October," Wren said. Lottie's expression held the complex mixture of a person who has done something both difficult and necessary. "My father has been sitting in my back room since October. Feeding him was the easy part." The hearing convened on April the 9th in the Crook County Courthouse in Sundance, a wood-frame building that smelled of sawdust and the accumulated gravity of official proceedings. Judge Aldrich Pruitt presided, a lean, deliberate man in his middle 50s, whose reputation in the territory rested on an almost physical resistance to being influenced by anything other than the evidence before him. He had affirmed Voss's transfer the previous October on the basis of documentation that had been thorough and correctly stamped. He was not a corrupt judge. He was a careful judge who had been carefully deceived, and there was a particular quality to his attention at the April session that suggested he had spent some time in the intervening months wondering. Voss attended with his lawyer, a man from Cheyenne who wore his suit with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most prepared person in any given room. The room held more people than it had chairs for. Walt Seeger stood against the back wall with the Henderson boys beside him. Reverend Oakes occupied a seat in the second row. His hands folded, his expression the particular attentiveness of a man who has reassessed his understanding of how the world works. 3 other families from the valley filled the remaining space. They had traveled in mud and cold that still had teeth on horses that were thinner than they had been in November. Wren sat at the table with the oilskin pouch in front of her unopened. August Fenwick sat beside her. He had dressed in the best of what he owned, a wool coat brushed clean, a collar ironed by Lottie the night before. His hands rested on the table with the patience of objects that had done their work and were prepared to do more. Pruitt reviewed the original transfer document. He reviewed Wren's challenge, which Walt had helped her file with the clerk 3 days earlier. He reviewed the 1869 certificate, which Wren laid before him from the oilskin pouch, its ink brown with age, its paper still sound. Pruitt looked at it for a long time. Voss's lawyer moved with efficiency. He questioned the certificate's chain of custody. It had not been in the county record office, he noted, but in the possession of the claimant, which raised obvious questions about its integrity. He questioned whether a document held by an interested party constituted independent evidence. He then turned to August. The old man's credibility was the target. 78 years of age, memory subject to the erosions of time. His residence in Lottie Fenwick's storage room, undisclosed to any official, suggested a degree of coordination that called his independence into question. August listened to all of this with the stillness of stone. When Pruitt invited him to respond, he rose from his chair slowly with the deliberate respect of a man who understood that certain moments required a person to stand upright for them. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform indignation. He placed his right hand on the table, spread the fingers, and looked at them for a moment before looking at Pruitt. "I have been working stone since I was 19 years old," he said. "I am 78 now. In that time, I have worked alongside perhaps 200 men in various conditions, in various counties, in various states of this country. I remember their hands because hands are how a stone man knows another stone man. The angle of a grip tells you what a man can do, what a man has done, what has been done to him." He paused. "I remember Elias Calloway's hands because in the autumn of 1868, we spent 4 days laying the foundation of the cabin on that property together. His right thumb had been broken in a stone-working accident the previous winter, and it never set in alignment. The thumb operated at a significant deviation from its natural axis. This affected every gripping motion he made for the rest of his life. It affected his signature. He looked then at the transfer document, not with contempt, but with the dispassionate attention of a man examining a joint that had been set incorrectly. The signature on that transfer was made by a hand that could produce an unbroken curved stroke on the capital letter. I will tell this court under any oath it requires that the hand I knew for 15 years could not have made that stroke after the winter of 1867. Not in 1871, not in 1881, not on any document bearing any date after the accident. The hand simply did not have the range of motion. The room held its silence in the way that rooms hold silence when something has been said that everyone present understands to be in the plain sense of the word true. Pruitt looked at the two signatures side by side for a measured interval. He looked at August. He looked at Voss, who was looking at the table with the expression of a man who has finally arrived at a full accounting of the costs of a decision made years ago in a moment of confident miscalculation. The lawyer tried twice more his arguments, losing structural integrity as they were made. Wren did not speak again after her initial presentation. She did not need to. August had said the only thing that needed saying, and he had said it with the precision of someone who had spent 60 years learning how to look at a piece of work and tell the truth about it. The gavel came down at 2:30 in the afternoon. The transfer was nullified. The title was restored to its 1869 condition, the original certificate entered into the county record. Harlan Voss faced criminal referral on charges of document fraud to be examined by the territorial prosecutor. Pruitt noted without elaboration that the court took a serious view of the use of fraudulent instruments to dispossess lawful property holders in Wyoming territory. Voss did not contest the ruling. He sat with his hands folded on the table until the room had largely emptied, then rose with the movement of a man whose resources had been spent on a project that had failed and walked out into the April mud of Sundance without speaking to anyone. He sold his remaining holdings in Crook County before summer and moved east, taking whatever capital remained to him, leaving behind a large drafty house that stood empty for 2 years before a family from Nebraska bought it, pulled the green lumber walls apart, rebuilt them with seasoned timber, and stayed for 3 generations. Sheriff Denton Marsh filed paperwork the following week that could have been read as a resignation, then withdrew it after a conversation with Pruitt. He served 2 more terms with the particular conscientiousness of a man redeeming a specific debt to a specific place. On the occasions when he rode past the Callaway property and saw Wren working the land, he removed his hat. It was not a performance. It was the only apology he was capable of making that matched the size of what he owed. The land came back to Wren in May when the ground was soft enough to receive a spade without effort. She did not celebrate. She went to work. The cabin roof needed repair, the barn corner, the south fence line where 2 posts had heaved in the freeze. She worked through the spring and into summer with the same economy of motion she had always brought to it, her hands moving with the competence of someone who understood that a thing done well required only the labor, it required nothing more. The hill remained. She did not fill in the chamber or seal the entrance or treat it as something finished. Over the following years, she improved it incrementally, a proper stone chimney to replace the hollowed log flue, a small south-facing window cut through the hillside with great effort, a shelf along the east wall for books. The temperature in the main chamber stayed at 48 degrees through every summer, every winter, every season that arrived, with the regularity of physics. Each September, when the air began to carry the first suggestion of what was coming, people came to the Callaway property. Not in the desperate manner of that first winter, they came deliberately with their tools, with their families, with the specific, purposeful attention of people acquiring knowledge they intended to use. Wren taught each group the same principles in the same order, with the same requirement at the end: draw it back for me from memory, then teach the next person who needs it. The knowledge moved outward across Crook County and into the neighboring counties, passing from hand to hand through the practical medium of instruction. Families who had never met Wren Callaway built their winter shelters from diagrams that were 3rd and 4th generation copies of the one she had drawn on a flat stone in the dark of February. The knowledge saved people she would never know in winters she would not live to see. August Fenwick lived until 1891, passing quietly in Lottie's house above the store, in a proper bedroom with a proper window, having spent his last years in the unhurried manner of a man who had done what he came to do. Lottie closed the store in 1898 and moved to Cheyenne to live with her daughter. Before she left, she came to say goodbye to Wren, standing in the yard in the early morning. He told me once, she said, meaning her father, that Elias Calloway was the best stone man he ever worked beside. He said Elias could look at a wall and see whether it would stand in 20 years. Wren looked at the hill above them, at the barely visible outline of the door slab against the slope, at the thin shadow of the vent pipe above it. He was right about most things, she said. He just never explained himself until after the fact. The years settled around the property the way snow settled around a structure built to receive it, conforming to the shape rather than altering it. Wren grew old in the way that people who have spent their lives in physical work grow old, the hands first, the joints thickening, the skin thinning over bones that had absorbed 4 decades of Wyoming weather. Her eyes stayed clear, her posture stayed straight. She never acquired the habit of explaining herself to people who had not yet earned the explanation. On a cold night in March of 1931, she died in her sleep in the cabin her father had built in a bed positioned beside the window that looked west toward the hill. She was 73 years old. The death was unremarkable in its mechanics. A heart that had worked reliably for 7 decades simply ceased to do so, and remarkable in every other sense, because the woman who died was not the sum of a legal case or a winter survived, but the carrier of a specific kind of knowledge that had moved through a community and changed it in ways no deed of title could measure. She left no will. The property passed to the county, which sold it 2 years later to a family named Broward, who ran cattle on the flat sections. The cabin lasted until 1943, when a series of wet winters finally compromised the roof beyond repair. By 1950, nothing remained above ground except the stone foundation, the base of the chimney, the outlines of the barn where the corner posts had rotted and collapsed. The land looked like land that had been empty for a long time. In the summer of 1951, a 12-year-old boy named Thomas Broward was clearing brush on the western slope of the hill when his boot heel caught on something solid beneath the overgrowth. He pulled back the grass with his hands. A flat stone large fitted into the hillside with a precision that did not look like the work of weather. He called his father. They worked the slab free together, the two of them, using a fence post as a lever, the stone grinding as it moved against the earth that had held it for decades. The air that came up from below was cool, steady, smelling of nothing in particular, or rather smelling of time, which has a smell that is the absence of ordinary smells. Thomas went down first into the dark, one hand trailing the stone wall. His father handed him a flashlight. The beam swept the chamber walls, straight joints, tight, the small stove still sitting on its base in the northeast corner, its iron long since cold. A wooden crate against the far wall, its lid intact. Thomas opened the crate. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had gone stiff but had done its work, were several objects: a tin cup, a whetstone, a folded piece of brown paper. Beneath these, in a separate compartment, his father saw over his shoulder was the oilskin pouch. His father opened it. Inside, brown with age but legible, were 2 documents. He read them slowly in the flashlight's beam, his lips moving slightly. Then he looked at his son. "This land," he said, and had to pause because the sentence was larger than the next word could carry. He tried again. "A woman lived here. She kept this land by knowing things about stone and cold that nobody bothered to write down anywhere except in the ground itself." He held the certificate up so the flashlight caught it. "Her father put this here so she would find it when she needed it. She did." Thomas looked at the walls around him, at the ceiling that had held at the stove that had burned and gone dark and been still for 20 years, and yet sat on its base with the assurance of something built by someone who knew what they were building. He felt the cool, stable air of the chamber, that 50-degree constancy that nothing above ground had interrupted in 80 years. "Why didn't she take it with her?" he asked. "The document. When she won." His father looked at the pouch in his hands, at the stone walls, at the steps leading back up to the surface. He thought about this for a long moment, with the seriousness the question deserved. "Because the stone was safer," he said at last. "It was always safer." He placed the pouch back in the crate, folded the oilcloth over it with care. They climbed back out into the July sun of Wyoming, which was bright without apology, warming the south-facing slope, the way it had always warmed it, the way it would continue to do through every August that followed its heat, passing slowly into the earth, held there through the cold months by a massive stone laid by a man who trusted the physical world more than he trusted the one made of paper. The door slab went back into place. The hill looked as it always had, a slope of grass rising toward a sky that did not distinguish between the living and the dead, only between what held and what did not. Below it in the dark and the constant cool, the ground remembered.